Hello, everybody. And it's such a pleasure to be here. And so I'm going to be covering education and lobbying. Where's the line? What's the difference? What you can and can't do as a 501c3 and what you can and can't do with federal money. Next slide, please. Okay, when it comes to education and lobbying, do you sometimes feel like this? Gee, I'd really like to do it, but I'm just not quite sure exactly what the rules are and what I'm able and not able to do. Next slide, please. Or this. Well, I guess because I don't really know what to do, I'm just gonna sort of not do anything because it's very, very confusing. Or this. Next slide. Yikes, this is totally confusing and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to be doing or not doing. Help. Or this. I'm going to do it regardless of whether or not I'm going to end up crashed on the other end because I know it's the right thing to do, or this. Hopefully, at the end of the presentation, you're all going to feel like you know exactly what it is you can and can't do and how to get what you want done. Okay, next slide, please. So what is education in a policy context? Education really is sharing data and information with elected officials and policymakers so that they understand what the issues you're dealing with are and what the best solutions will be to deal with them. Next slide, please. So if your organization is solely only funded with federal dollars, can you educate your elected officials at all levels, local, state, and federal? The answer is an absolute yes. Education is not considered lobbying. You are absolutely allowed to educate elected officials about issues you're facing in your community and your state and nationally, and how you think they should be addressed. And that's 100% fine to do, as long as you're not mentioning or taking specific positions on specific bills or specific pieces of legislation. Next slide, please. So those receiving only federal or state funds can and absolutely should educate their elected officials at any level and all levels of government about who you are, what you do, who you do it with, who is involved in your coalition, what your local data is telling you, specific issues that are impacting your community, what you're doing to address these issues, what the gaps are in your being able to address these issues, what some of the challenges that you're facing are that perhaps they could be helpful in helping you address. You can certainly share what funding you receive, from what sources, how you're using it, what more can be done to address the issues in your community that you've identified. And absolutely, the reason this is in all caps, please always share your outcomes and successes with your elected officials so that they know not only that you are a resource, but that you're someone who's really making a difference in their community with the funding that you have. You definitely want them to know who you are, what you do, and what your successes are. And all of that is considered education. Next slide, please. So those receiving only federal or state funds can and should always educate elected officials about everything I just told you about in the previous slide, but also about the effects of specific substances, what you're seeing as far as old trends and new trends with alcohol, tobacco, all drugs in your community, and what the effects of specific policies such as marijuana legalization or changes in alcohol policy because of the pandemic. If you have data on the effects of those policies and you can share them, then that's another thing that's really totally education and that everybody can and should be doing. Next slide, please. So those only receiving federal or state funds, again, can and should educate their elected officials at all levels of government by setting up and attending meetings with them. If they don't know who you are, they're going to be less likely to listen to you and support what you need. You can set up specific briefings for them on everything we just discussed, the challenges you're facing, the outcomes you have, the effects of specific policies that you would or would not like to see in your community. You can conduct large public education campaigns, and you can always push for better enforcement of existing laws. All of that is considered education. And if you think about it, there's a lot you can do in the education realm to really build relationships with your elected officials so that they really do understand who you are, what you do, the problems you're facing, the outcomes you've come, and what you need from them to help you better do your jobs in your community, in your state, and nationally. Next slide, please. So, examples of education. CDC's alcohol program found that 1 in 6 US adults binge drink about once a week, averaging 7 drinks a binge. So if you're interested in raising awareness about alcohol behavior, or if you have local data that can be compared to the CDC data to be able to show that you're either making progress on binge drinking or losing progress, this is definitely an example of something that can be shared with elected officials. Next slide, please. More examples. Past year marijuana vaping holds steady. Anything from monitoring the future, the Youth Risk Behavior Survey, the National Survey on Drug Use and Health, definitely shareable. Your own data that compares how you're doing with 30-day, past year, or lifetime use of a substance for, middle and high school students compared to national data to show either that you have a terrible problem or that you've made great progress and much better than national averages. All of that are examples of education, and it's important to share this type of information with your elected officials, because if you don't share it with them, no one is going to, and they're never going to know about what the issues being faced in your community by adolescents and others are, or what some of the solutions might be, unless they actually hear about it from you. Next slide, please. So examples of education effects of specific drugs. So I think all of you know that a NIDA study did show that early persistent use of marijuana can cause a permanent drop in IQ of up to 8 points. That you're never going to get those back. And a loss of 8 IQ points can drop a person of average intelligence into the lowest third of the intelligence range. This is an example of education, and it's something that most elected officials will have no idea about unless they hear it from you, unless you share it with them as a reason that more and more acceptance and availability of marijuana is probably not a good thing. Next slide, please. Another example of the effects of specific policies. Again, this is for monitoring the future. Differences among 12th graders by state. And you can see the non-medical marijuana states are the ones without the hashtag in it, and the marijuana states are the ones with the little boxes within the green boxes. And there was a statistically significant increase in past year marijuana use among 12th graders in states that had legalized marijuana. So that's an effect of a specific policy, and again, absolutely fine to share as education. Next slide, please. So strategies that drug-free communities, coalitions, and others who are federally funded can use that are education. So do general public education about the science of alcohol, tobacco, and drug use and addiction to raise awareness. Partner with local newspapers to do a series about the science related to issues such as youth brain development and alcohol, tobacco, and drug use, or what you're doing to stop the pipeline to addiction by getting unused and unwanted medications out of people's homes, etc. And share data and information about the effects in other states or other jurisdictions of policy changes being considered in your jurisdiction that you'd like to point out have not worked in these other jurisdictions. Sharing what hasn't worked in other places for stuff like marijuana legalization is education. You're not asking them to do or not do anything. You're just telling them that there's been a problem with these policies somewhere else, and then you can show them what those problems have been. Next slide, please. Okay, you can provide educational workshops for various sectors and audiences, provide toolkits. You can do focus groups on youth and parent attitudes about issues such as underage drinking, vaping, marijuana use, so that you really understand where people are coming from, what their attitudes are, so that you can, if those attitudes are not based on the science, you can try to really work in your community to raise awareness about, what the real deal is. You can implement strategies to change community norms and convene specific community members, such as elected officials, for fora to educate them about the effects of specific alcohol, tobacco, and drug issues, policies, what hasn't worked in other places, etc. Next slide, please. So, education, which we just talked about, is really educating elected officials on, from A to Z, anything that you can think of related to what you do, what's going on in your community, your data, the science around alcohol, tobacco, drug, vaping issues. Education crosses the line into lobbying when you take a specific position on a specific piece of legislation, a specific bill, or a specific ballot initiative or proposition, which is the way a lot of the marijuana legalization and medical marijuana policies were changed, was using ballot initiatives. So education crosses into lobbying when you take specific positions on specific bills or specific ballot initiatives. Next slide, please. So again, what's lobbying? Lobbying is taking a specific position on a specific piece of legislation or ballot initiative or proposition. Next slide, please. So here's the example. This week, the Senate Judiciary Committee heard testimony on a bill to tax and legalize marijuana. That bill would be BS 334. So that is referring to a specific piece of legislation. And the next thing to make it a lobbying thing is taking a position, which is Congress needs to oppose that bill to prevent the legalization of recreational marijuana use. So this is an example where you see takes a specific position, oppose on a specific piece of legislation, BS 334. Next slide, please. So here's how to use facts to educate. In the following slide, I'm going to use the exact same facts to lobby. So this is, hi, I want to share some information that you might not be aware of. States that have legalized marijuana are clustered at the top of the list in terms of marijuana use among 12 to 17-year-olds. And then, throwing in the NIDA-funded study shows that early persistent use of marijuana can cause up to 8-point drop in IQ. And you're not taking a position, you're just educating them. And then you're saying, hey, if I can provide you with any additional information, let me know. You can definitely go and talk to people in your state, elected officials about this. Next slide, please. This slide is actually identical to the previous slide. However, it urges them to vote against. And this one says any marijuana legalization legislation. It doesn't have a specific bill number, but it's lobbying just because you're saying you're urging them to vote no, vote against a piece of legislation, even though this one doesn't mention a specific bill number. If there's pending legislation on marijuana legalization and you're urging them to vote no, then that's lobbying. But you can see that you can make the exact same case and just change the ask from, hey, just wanted you to know about this, let me know if you need more information, to I urge you to vote no. And that's where it becomes lobbying. Next slide, please. So here are examples of lobbying language. Oppose HR 2564. We urge Senator X to support HR 2564. Vote no on that bill. Vote yes. So these take a position and refer to a specific piece of legislation, so they're lobbying. Next slide, please. So here's the lobbying language, which is support, don't support, oppose, don't pass, vote no, vote for, vote against. These are the words that are used to tell people what position you think they should take on a specific piece of legislation. Next slide, please. Now, here are examples of non-lobbying phrases that you can definitely get away with using in trying to make very similar points without telling people how to vote. We appreciate your work on HR 2567. So you're telling them, thank you for working on it. You're not taking a position. Again, we're thanking you for working on a specific piece of legislation. We're concerned about. We have concerns about. You're not telling them to oppose. You're not telling them to support. You're saying, I'm concerned with this bill because, and then you can tell them why it's concerning. We want you to understand that, and then go on with your concerns, or we need you to know, this can also be positive. We need you to know that this would have a positive impact in our community. Again, you're not saying how they should vote, you're just letting them know what you need them to know. We want to bring your attention to the fact that, and then go ahead and tell them what you're trying to bring to their attention, again, without telling them how to vote. There are the following issues regarding this bill that we think are important for you to understand. Again, you're pointing out issues, not telling them how to vote, want to make you aware of. And we know from NIDA, from the science, that this legislation would be a positive development or would be a problem regarding whatever it is that you know from NIDA, without, again, taking a specific position or telling them how to vote, yes, no, support, don't support, oppose, etc. Next slide, please. So you can educate and lobby both, as long as you know and play by the rules. Next slide, please. So what are these rules? There are definitely, go back one slide, please, Chris. There are definitely lobbying rules for 501c3s that are in federal law that everybody needs to be aware of. So next slide, please. Okay, so if you're a 501c3, and I know all of you are not, many of you are, some of you work for units of local government and other organizations that might not be 501c3 nonprofits, but if you are a 501c3 organization and you receive a mixture of federal and non-federal, non-restricted funds mean non-federal, not state, and there's no restrictions on them, sort of privately raised funds. Can you lobby? And the answer is yes. Actually, legally, under IRS rules, you can use up to 20% of your 501c3 organization's first $500,000 in tax-exempt expenditures to lobby, which 20% of $500,000 is $100,000. That's quite a lot of money to be able to lobby with. But the big but is you cannot use any of your federal funds to lobby. Next slide, please. And here's the chart from the IRS on how much 501c3s are permitted to use on direct lobbying. So it's 20% of the first $500,000, 15% of the second $500,000, and 10% of the third $500,000. So it's a lot that you can use. However, again, there are rules that you need to follow if you intend to do this. Next slide, please. So if your 501c3 chooses to lobby, CATCA is a 501c3, we lobby, and we file this IRS Form 5768. Stay on this slide for a minute because I want to explain this. So in the past, there was something called the no substantial parts test for 501c3s for lobbying, and in federal law, it said that 501c3 nonprofits could not use a, quote, substantial part of their income to lobby. The problem with that was nobody understood what constituted a substantial part. So there was a lot of ambiguity, and you could get in trouble. Was a substantial part 50%, 10%, 80%, 5%? No one knew. So you were sort of left open to getting in trouble with the IRS or having people claim you were lobbying when you weren't supposed to. So the IRS actually did come up with how 501c3s can keep track of their actual lobbying expenditures under the law by having people fill out this form 5768. Next slide, please. So why would you want to file with the IRS if you want to lobby? Well, first of all, filing provides liberal limits on how much money can be spent. I just showed you, you can spend up to 20% of your first $500,000 in income. There are extremely clear definitions of what lobbying is and isn't. It's not at all opaque. It's very clear. Lobbying is taking a specific position on a specific piece of legislation. And you have the ability to monetize your actual lobbying expenses, which protects you if you get audited or if questions are, please go back, Chris, questions are raised about how you've spent your funds. Okay, next slide, please. So how do you file the IRS Form 5768? And I'm telling you all this, and I know I've spoken on this a lot in the past, and people are afraid to file because they're afraid then if they're applying for a federal grant, they have to claim that their organization does some lobbying, and it, they're afraid it'll get them in trouble. But this is a protective factor. So you begin with your Form 990 Part 4. You just need to fill that out. Next slide, please. Then you go to Schedule C of the Form 990, and you have to complete it to say that you actually do some lobbying. Next slide, please. And then when you keep track of how much money you actually spend, when you've monetized how much you've spent on direct lobbying, you actually fill out this IRS Form 5768, and you tell them that you're under the limit. Okay, next slide, please. If your organization receives only federal funds, can it lobby or fight ballot initiatives or propositions? The answer is an absolute zero, no, you cannot do it. All lobbying is totally prohibited as a use of federal funds and federal matching funds. So in the past, I know a lot of DFCs would match 2 to 3 times the amount of the grant. And the problem with doing that, especially if you have actual cash, is that the match becomes federal money when you apply it in your grant application. And so you can't use either your federal funds or your matching funds to lobby. So once you say it's match for a federal dollar, it becomes a federal dollar itself, and the same rules and regulations apply to the match at that point. Next slide, please. But, and this is a really big but, and it's really important here, you don't lose your rights to petition your government because you take federal grant money. When you are off duty from your position, and this is even if you're 100% federally funded, or work for a group that is not a 501c3. When you're off duty from your position and you're acting as a private citizen, you're absolutely allowed to lobby, to take positions on legislation and propositions, to testify, to do whatever it is you want as yourself, not being paid to do that by the grant. You can also use your coalition's board members or volunteers to lobby as long as no federal funds are used and it's not part of your match. So there's a lot of ways to get around some of this, especially given coalitions have so many sectors and sector reps who are actually faith community business, people who lobby all the time. There's no reason that they can't, they just can't use the federal funds or the match to do it. Next slide, please. So you should also know that communications to the public that refer to a specific ballot initiative or proposition are treated by the IRS rules as direct lobbying, because the IRS recognizes that for ballot initiatives, the public itself acts as the legislature, because they're the ones that are going to be voting on something. Next slide, please. So if you are federally funded, you can't use any of your federal or state dollars to support or oppose specific legislation or specific ballot initiatives or propositions. You can, however, use non-restricted funds from non-governmental sources that you keep track of or do this during non-working hours on your own time and your own equipment. So everyone can definitely do that. Next slide, please. So what else can you do if you're only federally funded, if you have no non-restricted funds at all? You can partner with groups and organizations that are part of your coalition or are like-minded in the community, such as the faith community, civic organizations, the business community, media, and have them actually cross the line into taking the positions for you. You can use your board members and volunteers, but as themselves, not necessarily as members of the coalition. And you cannot use any of your grant or matching funds that you delineated in your grant application to do any of this, but that doesn't mean you can't find a way around it to be able to do what you need to do to get the work in your community done that you want to do as far as policy legislation. Next slide, please. So examples of things that are not considered lobbying under federal tax law: meeting with a legislator to talk about a social problem without mentioning a specific piece of legislation. And I'm going to say this 100 times in the rest of this presentation: context, timing, and motivation matter. If you're going in to talk to a legislator about marijuana, say, and it's 5 days before they're going to be voting on a legalization bill or something, it could be looked at as if it was lobbying, even though you're not crossing the line. So timing does matter, but for the most part, if you're going to talk generally about issues with specific drugs or other problems and not mention a specific piece of legislation, that is not considered lobbying. You can respond to a written request from a legislative committee or subcommittee for information about a specific piece of legislation. And at that point, if they ask you what your position is in writing, you can certainly tell them why that is not considered lobbying under federal tax law. Next slide, please. Advocate for better enforcement of existing laws, so controlling alcohol sales to minors. Advocate for the enactment or enforcement of private or voluntary policies, like changing alcohol purchase restrictions in stadiums. Conduct public education campaigns to affect the opinions of the general public, mass media, educational campaigns about the importance of not providing alcohol to minors, the danger of marijuana, nicotine, vaping, etc. The only caveat there is that, again, context, timing, and motivation matter. So just use your discretion on when you're going to do some gigantic public education campaign around marijuana. It shouldn't be 2 weeks before the citizens are going to be voting on a marijuana initiative to legalize it. Otherwise, 100% fine to do it, and it's not considered lobbying. Next slide, please. Okay, raising unrestricted funds is really, really, really important if you guys are going to want to actually legally cross over into lobbying and not use any of your federal or matched funds. Next slide, please. So what are unrestricted funds? Unrestricted funds are non-state, non-federal, non-matching dollars. They are privately raised funds that can be used to lobby and can be used to take positions on legislation and initiatives and propositions. So how do you get unrestricted funds? Next slide, please. Well, you can have everyone in your coalition contribute $50 of their own money. You can hold a bake sale and raise money. You can ask a partner organization or a business for an unrestricted donation that doesn't count towards your match. You can charge admission for some sort of an event. There's a lot of ways to raise unrestricted funds, and it's a good thing to have a little bit of unrestricted money. Next slide, please. So why are unrestricted funds needed? Because they legally can be used to lobby for or against legislation and to take positions for or against ballot initiatives. So if that's something that's in your work plan that you want to do, or you're just not in your work plan, but you want to do it, you can't use your federal funds. Next slide, please. So monetizing lobbying efforts, as you saw, the IRS actually has you monetize how much money you've spent on actual direct lobbying, taking specific positions on specific pieces of legislation. So here's an example. If someone has a salary of $50,000 a year, that translates into $1,000 a week, $200 a day, $24 an hour, or 40 cents a minute. So next slide, please. So before you're going to undertake any lobbying effort at all, you really need to figure out about how many actual hours that task will take, who's going to do them, and what their hourly rate is, and add all of these up to get a total estimated cost, and then use or raise your unrestricted funds to do it. And I'm going to show you in a minute, it's not a lot of money to actually undertake something like this. Next slide. So CATCA's legislative alerts, by the way, are not lobbying because you send them in as an individual from your home address. So this isn't to say that if you respond to CATCA's legislative alert, you're lobbying. It's just a way to show you that it takes 2 minutes to do something like that, times 40 cents would be 80 cents. And it would be like $8. So if you were gonna do it from your office on your office computer, very cheap. Or everyone actually does and can do this from their home, and all of our legislative alerts you're sending in as a private citizen using your home address. There's nothing on the alerts that identifies you as working for a coalition, being a coalition leader, or anything else. So totally you can do CATCA's legislative alerts. Next slide, please. So as I said 16 times before this, context, timing, and motivation matter. You can do a lot of educating and it's great, but if you're doing your educating right before someone's voting on something, it might be misconstrued as not being education. However, I'm going to say here that getting in touch with your elected officials in Washington, D.C. and their staff, I've never heard of anyone who's gotten in trouble for doing that. It's usually when you're doing something in your community, especially around raising taxes on alcohol or tobacco or fighting against marijuana legalization, that people might be watching and claiming that, maybe you're doing something you're not supposed to be doing. So context, timing, and motivation matter. Just be careful on the timing of like big public education campaigns right before a vote on an initiative or a bill. That's the caution. Otherwise, feel free to do it. It's not considered lobbying under federal IRS law. Next slide, please. Again, consider the timing and circumstance and the intent of your education efforts. It's just a caution. It's not saying not to do it or that you shouldn't do it. Next slide, please. Is there a bill being considered on the topic as you're doing your education? Something to be cautious about, but not to stop you necessarily. Next slide, please. Is there a ballot initiative being considered on the topic? Again, given that for ballot initiatives, the public is considered the legislature, DFCs especially need to be not using federal funds to influence how they vote right before the vote. So I wouldn't do that in October if the vote is in November, but if you did it in April, it would be considered education probably. Next slide, please. How is your message going to be perceived? Again, if you're targeting messages to voters prior to a ballot initiative, it might be perceived as lobbying or political activity. Next slide, please. And here, this is very important. I know that the writing is sort of small. I'm going to go through all of these 9 steps. So education versus lobbying for getting bills introduced or local ordinances passed. So what's considered education? Gathering data and the analysis to make your case that a piece of legislation is needed is education. Identifying and engaging allies and the people you're going to work with in your community or your state to make the case, definitely education. Setting up meetings with potential legislative champions to brief them on the issue in general, to show them the data that you've collected and the analysis that you've done to make the case that this is something that's really needed. Again, that is considered education. Number 4, I definitely have as education. There are other groups that consider this is the beginning of lobbying, but I think this is 100% fine. If you want to research model legislation or model ordinances, things that other jurisdictions have passed for the exact, type of issue that you're looking to get something passed on, I think that that's fine to do so that you can see how other people have written this up, what they've used, how they've done it. And that's 100% fine. I actually think it's also fine to share that. This moves into lobbying where no federal funds can be used when people start drafting the actual language of the bill or the ordinance, presenting the draft bill to potential champions, recruiting support in the legislature or the city council, testifying for or against a bill or ordinance at a hearing. If you are asked in writing to do it, you can, as the head of the coalition, you can do it. If not, you can do it as a concerned citizen. You can do it as a public health expert in your community. You just probably don't want to take a position at a public hearing for or against something using your federal dollars because it's not allowed, which isn't to say you can't do it as yourself, as an expert in the community on an issue. As people prepare for the vote and you're trying to mobilize people to support or oppose a specific bill or ordinance, again, that's lobbying, but you have other partners hopefully in the coalition like the PTA and the faith community and business community that can really take that on for you and do it for you, and they just wouldn't do it in the name of the coalition. So that's sort of the breakout for getting bills or ordinances introduced and passed, of what part of that process is education and what part of that is lobbying. Next slide, please. Again, be aware of gray areas. I want to say here, my team and I, Katka, Chris Dorn, and Alex Mahoney, probably get 2 or 3 requests a week from the field for guidance about what's education, what's lobbying, what they can and can't say, how to say it. We are always available if you have questions about whether you can or can't do something. And I will always make sure to help you figure out how to do it by doing what we said, doing it on your own time, using other people in the coalition who can do it. There's ways around everything, and we will certainly be there to guide and help you, and also to rewrite things so that something that might have been lobbying because it said support, oppose, we can say have concerns with, or rewrite it to use sort of the non-lobbying language so that the same piece can be used as education. So do not hesitate if you have questions to reach out to me and my staff at Katka. We are always there to help you, and it's really our pleasure to do so. Next slide, please. So here's the summary of what we have discussed so far. And so first of all, education versus lobbying. I want to say also, I did not use the word advocacy or advocating. There's no legal definition for advocacy. So education here is both educating people and also what you would think of as advocacy before it becomes lobbying. I'm just not using the term advocacy because it's not a legal term. It's not, there's no definition of advocacy, but there is definitions for education. So you need to know the difference between education and lobbying, which I think everybody knows at this point in the presentation. Federal grantees are legally prohibited from using federal funds for lobbying. The prohibition includes work done by key personnel paid with federal dollars or any match for the grant. And these limitations do not apply to you as an individual on your own time. Again, you don't lose your rights to petition your government because you are working on or taking money from the federal government. Before we go on to the next slide, I do want to say that Michael Mumper is on this call. He took it upon himself to do a 2-pager that we are working with a group that is the experts in lobbying for 501c3s in the country, the Alliance for Justice. And what he did was, and we are going to be getting it out to everyone in the field as soon as it's finalized, went through what's education and what's lobbying for you in wearing your different hats. So what can you do as an individual? What can you do as a coalition leader? What can you do as a coalition board member? What can you do as a coalition volunteer? And as you have heard from what I've said, the rules are a little different depending on what hat you're wearing. And we will be working with Michael. I just wanted to give him a lot of credit. He took it on himself because he thought this was, from my slides at the really beginning where you were like scratching your head, jumping off of a waterfall. He took it on himself to put a draft together. And then we got legal experts, lawyers who specialize in this area involved. And as I said, it's brilliant. And he did a brilliant job. And we will be getting that out with scale and scope to the field as soon as it's finalized. Next slide, please. So what keeps you up at night? What worries you about education, advocacy, and lobbying? And at this point, I'm going to open it up for questions, and Brittany is going to be my my person reading the questions that were in the chat box. And I see everyone in the chat saying, great job, Michael. And I want to say, Michael, great job. I'm so proud of you. And this is going to be such a helpful document. CADGA has a strategizer on this, but it really was about 501c3s. And Michael's really does go into a lot of detail in a very concise way on what you can do with your different hats. I'm sorry, go ahead, Brittany.
No, you're good. So we've got a couple of questions in the Q&A box. So the first one was from Ellis, who said, you mentioned you could not mention bills. I received an email today that it says from CADGA mentioning sending an email to our senator about the Safe Banking Act amendment. If I responded, is that crossing the line?
Well, here's the thing. As I said, any legislative alerts that come from CADGA, what you're asked to fill out is your name and your home address. And I would use your personal email. And if you do that, no, it's not considered lobbying. Because we're not putting in the address of your coalition or your coalition's name, you're sending it in as a private citizen. So everybody can do that. If you want to send it out to everyone in your coalition and ask all of them to do it, then I would do that from your home computer, not from your work computer. Because, you know, asking other people to do it, even though they're going to do it as individuals, you know, sort of crosses the line. But again, there's no reason that you can't send it out to your coalition thing from your Gmail account rather than your coalition account. But no, anyone doing any legislative alert from CADGA, it's going as Sue Thaw, 3511 Hamlet Place. It's not going as Sue Thaw, CADGA's lobbyist at CADGA's address. So everyone can do our legislative alerts. I hope that answers the question.
So Alice had also asked, what if your home and coalition work PC are one and the same and there are no paid positions within your coalition?
Oh, well, then you can do whatever you want. If you're not receiving federal funds, then this only applies if you're receiving federal funds. If you're not receiving federal funds, well, I don't know, if you have no funds and you're doing it from your kitchen table, I wouldn't worry about it at all. If you have some funds and you're a 501c3, but you don't have any federal or state funds, I would file that IRS form and just monetize what you're spending on lobbying. But this really only has to do with either 501c3 nonprofit funds or federally, you know, if you're federally funded, federal funds from the federal government or matching. I hope that answers the question, but boy, good for you to do coalition work without any federal money. Hats off, because that's how this field started and people were very active in all of this. And then as the federal money came, it became, you know, we're telling people to do environmental strategies, but then telling them they can't use their money to change policies. So we need to work really closely with everyone to figure out how to get around that. All right, Brittany, go ahead.
We ask a lot of people here, don't we? So Dare had asked, And I think this was in relation to the example you gave about education versus lobbying and how you just changed the language up slightly. I think it was slides 23 and 24.
Yep.
So they had asked, but can you use this language less the last sentence of urging to reconsider to consider bill? So I think they were asking if you can use the lobbying language, but pull out the specific sentence about considering the bill.
Well, you can basically say, I have concerns about this bill, but then you don't go to say, so I urge you to oppose it, vote yes, vote no. The lobbying language is just the last sentence of the thing, which is telling them what position they should take. So you can raise concerns about something, you just don't then go across the line into, therefore I urge you to vote no. I don't know, am I answering the question, or was that not the question?
No, I think that's the question. If it didn't quite answer the question, dare go ahead and resubmit if you need clarification somewhere in the Q&A box, because we've got a couple we'll get through, so we'll definitely get to it. So Christopher had asked, where does commenting on existing ordinances and the need for changes to existing laws fit in?
Well, changing an existing law or an ordinance is a change. You'd have to pass another ordinance or another law to change an existing law or an ordinance. So they that would be considered lobbying, but go back to what I said you could do. If there's a reason that it needs to be changed and you can document that and have data without giving them the language to actually change it, you can raise that it's a problem. And you can look at what other people have done in other jurisdictions to fix the problem. But once you get into sort of drafting the language, then you need to turn it over to other people in the community who can take it over the line and get it passed for you. Does that make sense? So you can make the case that there's a need to change an ordinance, but to actually work on the language to get it changed and then work with the committees and work to get it passed, that part of that equation becomes lobbying. And then you need to work with the other sectors in your coalition and other people who can actually lobby. But yeah,
So
changing an ordinance, you can't change a law and an ordinance without passing another law or an ordinance, if that makes sense.
So
that's the only way to change it.
So it sounds like it doesn't matter if it's a new law or if it's an existing law, the same rules still fundamentally apply.
Yeah, I mean, you can raise the issue of why something needs to be changed, but to be able to change a law, you have to pass another law.
Right.
You can't just change the law.
Okay. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So Celinda asked, what about local ordinances? Are the use of federal funds prohibited from taking positions on city, county, or school ordinances?
Yeah. Unfortunately, it didn't used to be that way. The federal lobbying laws up until 10 or 11 years ago prohibited you from lobbying at the federal or state level, but didn't prohibit you from lobbying or working on policy changes at the local level. That changed during the healthcare reform debate under the Obama administration. Big sugar and salt, so make the McDonald's of the world, the fast food people, the soft drink industry, snack industry, all the people that make people obese in America went nuts that changing people's eating habits was going to be sort of part of the prevention, part of healthcare reform. So the lobbying restrictions changed so that at that point they said you couldn't use federal money to work on or change local ordinances or laws. So that now is considered in your terms and conditions of your DFC. Now, the school board, they're elected. Again, there are ways to do this. If you want to work on changing school policy, I'd say just be careful how you do it, because that, again, that and zoning, that stuff was never considered lobbying, and now it's considered policy. So again, you can do it, just be careful. And if you have questions, please call us and we will help you figure out how to get it done without getting in trouble. I hope that answered the question.
I'm putting the email address for your team down in the chat box. It's just publicpolicy@cadca.org. So you can reach out to them and you can ask kind of the very specific questions to your situations there.
And yeah, people like Michael Mumper can attest. I mean, over Christmas, I was, helping him write an ordinance and be careful about it. So we're here to help in any way that we can.
All right, so Michael actually asked, do I understand correctly from slide 55 that coalition members of a federally funded coalition can submit model legislation to a city council or county commission, but not staff?
Wait, say that again?
So can coalition members of a federally funded coalition?
So, well, yeah, they can if they're not doing it in the name of the coalition. So if you have a business leader on your coalition, and he's the one that's going to be submitting it, but as himself. Yeah. Now the issue then becomes if there were federal funds used to do the research to find the language that you're using in the model ordinance, whatever, I wouldn't submit it in the name of the coalition. I would have someone else do it as themselves.
Okay. Virgil asked, how can youth be more engaged? Oh,
hey, youth should be engaged all the time because they can say anything they want to anybody. If you have youth on your coalition, I would have them be the messengers, especially about issues like marijuana, vaping, things that really, when youth tell elected officials what's really going on with kids their age, what they're really doing. I'm going to give you a really great example. Maybe, I don't know, 15 years ago on Capitol Hill Day, I went with a group of youth from California to talk to Dianne Feinstein, Senator Feinstein. And it was before the Monitoring the Future survey showed that more kids were smoking marijuana than smoking cigarettes. And before the data ever showed it, the kids knew it. And they told her that, and she was shocked. And then, of course, the data comes in, and it actually shows what the kids had said. Kids know what's going on before it shows up in the data. They are the best messengers on a lot of this. So can you train them? Can you use them? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I think that it's a great way. Now, if you're going to hire a bus with federal money to bring them to the Capitol, I'd probably, and then they're going to say what they're going to say, think about maybe getting them rides. You just have to, again, it's the caution thing. It's the context, motivation, and everything matter. But youth, I think, are the best messengers we have on a lot of this stuff. So thank you so much. It's a really great question, Virgil.
Yeah, and if the question is also about just generally how to get youth more engaged in your coalition, I know we have some previous webinar Wednesday recordings about that as well from 2020. So you can go and you can find those webinars and watch those ones as well, and those may be able to help. So Jennifer had asked if another organization who was funded with unrestricted dollars lists our coalition as part of a larger group that opposes a specific legislation, is that lobbying?
It sure is. You have to be really careful. Yeah, I hate to tell you that, but they can list the members of your coalition as individuals. So like, you have the healthcare people, the police. If yeah, I'd be careful about that. Unfortunately, it is lobbying. Now, it depends what the issue is and who's watching and if you're going to get in trouble. If it's a marijuana thing, I'd be really careful because the industry is really watching what we're doing. Same with some of the alcohol stuff. It's just tricky. It depends on the issue. But yes, if you're signing on to something that's taking a position on a specific piece of legislation, your coalition should probably not be named as your coalition. Okay. I hate to tell you that, but that's the law. Now, do people do it and do they get in trouble? Usually not. But yeah. But can you go on as a public health expert as yourself? Yes.
All right. So Marion had asked, can you explain the difference between a 501c3 and a 501c4?
Yes, a 501c3 is just a regular nonprofit doing good work in a community. And I'm not a lawyer, so I'm probably not the right person. A 501c4 is more of an advocacy or lobbying entity, and they are set up under different guidelines. So they're not just to enhance the public good, but they specifically, again, I have to actually, I don't know, Michael Mumford, if you've looked into this and you want to put something in the chat. I wasn't prepared for that question, so I apologize, but we'll get back to you with the actual legal definitions and the differences. They're legal definitions, they're IRS definitions. And I don't know the 501c4 one off the top of my head, I apologize.
So Stephanie had asked, what does it mean to spend funds on lobbying? Hiring a company to lobby, funds for travel to meet with legislators, etc.
Oh, well, that's a really good question. Yeah, hiring somebody, that spending so if, as we showed you the monetization thing, if you're on the clock being paid for your coalition to go to a meeting with a legislator to take a specific position on a specific piece of legislation, then your time to do that would be considered lobbying. Your time getting there would probably also be billed to lobbying. If you're going to bring a busload of people to the Capitol to spend taking positions on specific pieces of legislation, then the bus would probably be considered. If you're taking people to educate and not to take a specific position, same bus would probably not be considered a lobbying expense. So anything associated with your time, the materials that you're providing to lobby, your means of getting there, all of that would be stuff that you would monetize. So time, transportation, the time to put the stuff together, the time and the cost to make pamphlets or handouts or whatever, that would be, if you're going to be lobbying, that would be considered lobbying expenses. In addition, you don't have to hire a lobbyist to be taking positions on specific pieces of legislation.
Okay. So Laura had asked, as a public health department for the city and county, we are a local government organization that is also seen as a leader expert in health. Since we are also local government, my role seems a little unclear. Many health departments drafted ordinances specifically for COVID, for example. Was that because of unified command structure?
Oh, well, yeah, ordinances for COVID, I think you were told that you were doing it as a public health person. So I guess, if, like with marijuana, once it passes and you're, working in the public health department on the regulations, on monitoring the industry, blah, 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 that's all part of your job. It's just, but before that had passed, I guess your job could have been to say what you thought the public health impacts would have been, and that would have been sort of nonpartisan analysis of a health department, but it wouldn't have been your job to have lobbied against it at the state legislature, if that makes sense.
We'll see, Laura. If you need more information, I would reach out specifically to public policy at cadca.org.
Oh, she's talking about local ordinances. Yeah, I mean, if you're the local health department and they're asking you to help as the local health department expert on writing an ordinance, absolutely you can do it because you're being asked by your boss in the health department, or the city council has asked the health department for technical assistance or help. Absolutely, you can do that. That's different than just on your own coming up with an idea for a local ordinance. That no one in your hierarchy of command, has asked for. Yeah. But if it's part of your job and you're doing it as part of your job, then yeah, of course that's fine. They wouldn't be asking you to draft ordinances if they weren't needed in your community for a public health purpose.
Got it. So Jerry asked, what about 501c3s that get state or local money? Where does lobbying fit in with those?
It depends on the restrictions that come with the money. So we know in your terms and conditions for DFC exactly what you can and can't do. If you get state money, you have to check with whether there are restrictions on that money. And if you get local money, it's the same thing. I can't answer, even if some foundations will not let you use their money to lobby, even though legally it would be permissible. So every pot of money that you get would come with its own restrictions or non-restrictions. So this today was really about the laws about getting federal money and federal match. You actually have to check with the sources of the funding and see if there are any prohibitions in your terms and conditions or the contract that gave you the money for other sources of funding. So I just, without like looking at something, I can't tell you, like, I don't know the answer for if your city or county gives you money, can you use it to lobby? Probably not, but you'd have to check with the county attorney.
Got it. Laura asked, what are the rules for inviting/informing members of the community about a commission discussion regarding an issue we are interested in?
Oh, that's fine. As long as you're not taking a position or telling them what position to take, you can certainly do that.
Okay. Daniela asked, can I use data collected by my federal funded coalition to speak to elected officials when I am off duty?
Oh yeah, but you can use data that you've collected when you're on duty. That was the point about educating people. If you've collected data to show what's going on in your community or the outcomes from your DFC, that's not lobbying to share those with elected officials, to show them what the rates are, if they're going up or they're going down, for what substance. You can share all of that as education, all of that. It doesn't become lobbying until you're using it to tell them to take a specific position on a specific piece of legislation. That sort of goes back to the original slides. You can definitely use all of the information that has been gathered through your DFC to share with elected officials, because how else are they going to know what's going on in the community? It doesn't become lobbying until you say, and therefore you need to pass this ordinance or this specific bill with a specific number. You can use it to tell them that some policy or law has to be changed or ordinance in the community. You just have to stop at the point of researching what other people have done to deal with the issue. I know this is a lot, and I know it's very obtuse, so I apologize, because I know in some ways this presentation raises more questions than it answers, and I apologize for that. Again, call us if you have questions. We are there.
Yeah, so Nancy had put into the Q&A box that there's a city council public hearing tonight regarding opting out of marijuana dispensaries and lounges. And she's planning to send an email as a private citizen with her personal position. And then she's also planning to speak at the meeting to provide information about the impact of having dispensaries and lounges on youth and other communities as, quote, information I hope they will consider. But we'll stop short of suggesting how they vote. And then she added, as an addendum, I will attend the meeting off work hours and have been asked by city council members to share information about risks. Your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. You've been asked by them. If someone could give it to you in writing, that would be great. And if someone could give you in writing before tonight that they'd like to hear what your position is, you could probably give it, but you're doing everything right. You're going as yourself. You're going as an expert on public health and what's going on with youth in your community. You've researched what's happening in other places, and you probably don't have to tell them how you think they should vote. It's going to be very obvious by the time you tell them that having consumption lounges and other, places to publicly use indoors, anything that's combustible, also undermines the non-smoking indoors act that we've all been working on for 30 years. So no, absolutely, hats off to you. Great way to do it. And I'm glad that they've asked you as yourself, because you as yourself are an expert. So
She said that was my thought. Thanks for confirming, Sue.
Sure, absolutely.
So we've got one more. So if you've got any final burning questions, make sure to get them in. Allison wrote, our town has until the end of the year to opt out of local marijuana sales and on-site consumption sites. Are we as a coalition not able to attend town board meetings to educate officials on the negative effects this could have, since it could be considered timing and content? And then
Yeah,
I'll add,
but yeah, I would do it, but I would probably do it as experts in the community, not necessarily as the coalition. But I think, yeah, I think you should definitely go to the meetings. Yeah. I think when you weigh in to tell them what you think, you should probably do it as yourself. But I think it's critically important, especially if you have in your work plan, to try to keep kids from using or starting to use marijuana.
Jerry had suggested as a follow-up to it about why not show both sides of the opt-in and then opt-out and then opt-in. So
well, you can certainly do that, but I don't know that you want to make the other side's case for them, frankly.
No, that's very true. That's a good point.
So I that's why I wouldn't do that personally. I would do it as an expert in the community on, especially if the meetings are in the evening, I just wouldn't charge the time, and I would go as a public health expert with a lot of, anyway. I know.
Yeah. So Gwendolyn had asked, can your coalition state that they support a politician's decision to have voted no on marijuana legalization based on data that your survey has received? The politician has already voted no. We would just be stating our support after the fact.
Well, no, after the fact, I would thank them for keeping kids healthy and, drug free. Yeah, you can thank people after the fact. Absolutely. It's a great idea. You should give them an award. Would give them public recognition.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm not seeing any other questions currently, either in the chat box or in the Q&A box. So I will take this time to put into the chat box our evaluation link, and thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Sue, thank you so much for your time today and for answering all of these questions that come in.
Absolutely, and Chris Dorn, who's on the phone, who's amazing, who's the public policy manager at CACA, will get something out to Brittany on the difference between 501c3s and 501c4s, the legal definitions. And Brittany, can you get that out to the participants on this webinar?
Yeah, what we'll do is we'll post it along with the slides and the recording of this on the webinar Wednesday page. So when you go, when you're looking for the slides, you can find that information there.
Okay, that sounds great. And I really appreciate all of you tuning in to this. I know it's a hot topic. It's also a very obtuse one, and it makes everybody very uncomfortable. So whatever we can do to help, we're here. And I love helping people figure out how to make things happen and get around some of the rules to be able to do it. So call anytime. We love to hear from you.
Thank you so much, Sue. Everyone have a great Wednesday, and we will see you in October for our next webinar Wednesday, which will be with Brandis Belsar, a CDC project officer, and one of her coalitions that she works with, Juria Martin, talking about how you can better collaborate with your project officer. So be sure to join us for that one. Thanks, everyone, and have a great day. Bye.
Bye. Thanks, Brittany.